Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wally and Betsy Stern Conference Center at the Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a fellow here in the Europe practice, and normally our president and CEO, Ken Weinstein, would be standing in my place, especially for this event. He takes a great interest in trade. He serves on USTR's Advisory Committee on Trade Policy Negotiations, but as it happens, today is Hudson's board meeting, so he is on the train to New York, sends his greetings, and I'm sure we'll catch this later on the website. The occasion for today's conference is a report by Hudson's trade guru, Tom Duesterberg, on WTO reform. For those of you who came in, you should have seen copies in the back. If you weren't able to grab one, we'll have those available for you afterwards. And for those watching this online in the comforts of your office, the report is titled The Importance of WTO Reform from a Transatlantic Perspective. It should be available on our site and was made possible through the partnership of our good friends at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and Paul Linares here today will be quarterbacking our panel. But before we get to the panel, we have a very special guest to keynote today's event. Stephen Vaughn, the General Counsel of the United States Trade Representative, is here today. In this capacity, he serves and advises the USTR on all legal and enforcement matters. Mr. Vaughn has extensive experience in private practice, serving in the international trade groups at King & Spalding as well as Skadden. He has litigated cases involving anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards before numerous agencies and tribunals, including the U.S. International Trade Commission, the Court of International Trade, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, binational panels established pursuant to NAFTA and the WTO. He has advised clients on policy matters related to international trade, including the relationship between U.S. trade laws and U.S. WTO obligations, and the extent to which China has complied with its WTO obligations, amongst many other matters. Mr. Vaughn has served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Law. He earned his law degree from Yale, and holds a Bachelor of Arts from Vanderbilt. Yeah, well, but since you got your Bachelor's of Arts from Vanderbilt, my wife got her Bachelor of Arts from there too, and so I'll welcome you to the stage with the words anchored down. Thanks for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today about a critical topic, whether the United States and its allies can agree on WTO reform. I want to thank Thomas Duesterberg for his thoughtful piece on WTO reform from a transatlantic perspective. This is an important topic and one that is certainly worthy of serious consideration. So I know there's going to be a discussion, and I just want to begin the discussion by laying out some of the administration's views. I'm very fortunate in this regard because Ambassador Lighthizer discussed WTO reform yesterday before the Senate Finance Committee. The hearing obviously touched on a variety of issues, and I will not try to address all of them, but I would urge you to focus on three critical points made by Ambassador Lighthizer. First, the administration sees the value of a strong and effective WTO and is eager to work with other WTO members, including the European Union and Japan, on necessary reforms. Second, after almost a quarter century, the WTO is badly out of date and is incapable of dealing with many of the major challenges facing the international trading system. Third, we have to find a way to address the many problems within the WTO that are making it so difficult for multilateral trade negotiations to move forward. I will discuss each of these points. Let us begin, therefore, with the value of the WTO. When President Trump was elected, there were some who feared that the administration had little interest in an effective international trading system. I would hope that our actions over the last 2 years, as well as Ambassador Lighthizer's testimony yesterday, have put that notion to rest. Ambassador Lighthizer has repeatedly emphasized the potential benefits of an international organization where the nations of the world can work together to create more efficient markets. Under Ambassador Lighthizer's leadership, Ambassador Dennis Shea and the rest of our team in Geneva have worked vigorously to build support among members for a powerful reform agenda that would revitalize the WTO. Here are some examples of that agenda. The administration has pushed for stronger rules on notification so that members will be more likely to live up to their WTO commitments and provide vital information regarding subsidies and other trade distorting measures. Our support has not been merely rhetorical. We have tabled a text-based proposal with co-sponsors at the WTO to encourage members to fulfill existing notification commitments. Second, the administration has strongly encouraged more plurilateral negotiations, such as the ongoing negotiations regarding digital trade, so that WTO members will not be hamstrung by those members who are unwilling to update past agreements. Today, we are actively engaged in the digital trade negotiations. Next, the administration has urged members to stop abusing claims of developing country status, claims that are making it significantly harder to reach consensus on new rules. Again, our actions are not merely rhetorical. We have tabled a text-based proposal at the WTO asking wealthy countries to forego special and differential treatment in current and future negotiations. Next, the administration has advanced the functioning of the standing committees at the WTO, acting as a leader in using these venues to promote implementation of existing commitments. Also, the administration has aggressively used the WTO dispute settlement process, including in the context of the Section 301 investigation into China, when doing so would help pressure other countries to move in a more market-oriented direction. In short, the administration is not merely talking about revitalizing the WTO. We are actively working on a variety of efforts to achieve that goal. The administration's efforts, with the support of other members, could bring significant new energy to the WTO and show that it could be a useful instrument for making markets more efficient and encouraging economic growth. As Ambassador Lighthizer made clear yesterday, we remain committed to these efforts. Indeed, as the panel will undoubtedly discuss, Ambassador Lighthizer has personally participated in 5 separate trilateral discussions with Japan and the European Union regarding WTO concerns. In each of these meetings, we have urged our allies to adopt an ambitious approach to reform. These efforts are making progress. We have already agreed with Japan and the EU on a strong new proposal about notifications at the WTO. We are in general agreement with them on the need for stronger rules on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and other market-distorting practices. In short, there are great opportunities for the United States and its traditional allies to work together on these issues. However, as Ambassador Lighthizer also made clear yesterday, we face major challenges. The world for which the WTO was designed no longer exists. The WTO came into being at the end of the Cold War, a time of great celebration and optimism throughout much of the developed world. Many of us can recall the hopes for the future at that time, hopes for a world of liberal democracies and focused on true market competition, hopes that the old geopolitical divisions which had dominated most of the 20th century were finally coming to an end, hopes that most of the major issues on trade had been resolved. Now, almost 25 years later, those hopes have been disappointed. WTO members are not converging on market-based principles. Countries such as China have shown that under current WTO rules, their non-market economies can grow significantly faster than many market-based economies in the West. The major issues on trade have not been resolved. An array of new issues involving matters like digital trade, intellectual property rights, currency, and labor and environmental standards now demand attention. Workers throughout the Western world are not satisfied with the current trading system. Americans are, of course, familiar with the controversies over globalization in this country, but we are not alone. Consider the Brexit debate in Great Britain. the new populist government in Italy, or the Yellow Vest protests in France. Throughout the developed world, governments are grappling with the question of how to maintain good jobs and rising living standards for people once known as blue-collar workers. As currently constituted, the WTO is not able to address these challenges. The rules themselves are outdated. The WTO, like NAFTA, came into existence at a time when most Americans had never heard of the internet. The WTO's founders could not see all of the new trade issues resulting from the rise of digital trade and e-commerce. They certainly did not anticipate a situation where the world's second largest economy, China, would be in a position to buy up foreign companies, use informal means to pressure foreign companies into turning over their technology, and use means not covered in the WTO agreements, such as cyber hacking, to undermine true market competition. To make these points is not to criticize the WTO as it was originally designed or the people who created it. No generation of policymakers can be expected to solve every problem for all time. The best any of us can hope for is to address the problems at hand and to leave future problems to the future. Everyone knew in 1994 that new challenges would face the international trading system, just as new challenges had repeatedly faced the international trading system during the GATT era that began in 1947. As many of us remember, the expectation at the time was that further negotiations would take place inside the WTO, and that WTO members would work together, as GATT members had worked together, to update the rules as necessary. After all, under the GATT system, there had been no less than 8 completed rounds, each of which had led to increased market access. Under the WTO, however, it has so far proven impossible to make progress on the type of broad market opening agreement that took place under the GATT. The Doha round, the last major effort to achieve such an agreement, collapsed in failure and has effectively been dead for over a decade. Even more worrisome is the fact that many members now have no incentive to reach new agreements at the WTO and strong incentives to block further change. One such incentive is the promise of special and differential treatment to developing countries. As an additional matter, it is troubling to act as though following the basic rules of global trade will somehow discourage development. Surely, the whole point of such rules is to encourage stronger economic growth for everyone. How can we ask disadvantaged American workers to support the international trading system if we don't think that system is actually good for economic development? And how can we expect developing countries to adopt significant measures of economic reform when we appear to concede that their economies are not ready for such reform? But let us assume, for the sake of argument, that some WTO members require special and differential treatment because, for whatever reason, they are not able to compete on a level playing field. Even if we grant this assumption, that would not justify the current situation at the WTO, where some of the world's richest and most powerful economies, including China and South Korea, have claimed developing country status. It is unrealistic to expect any U.S. administration to provide special and differential treatment to countries like these. Such a result is supported neither by economic policy or by basic fairness. Until we find a way to address this problem, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to expect significant breakthroughs in multilateral trade negotiations. A second incentive to block new negotiations at the WTO results from the fact that some countries have much higher bound tariffs than others. The average bound tariff rate for goods entering the United States is only 3.4%, but countries such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and Turkey have much higher figures in excess of 25%. Perhaps such differences made sense years or decades ago when these numbers were first negotiated. But today, even when the tariffs are not set at the bound tariff rate, the existence of these high bound tariff rates creates uncertainty in global trade flows, putting U.S. companies and workers at a disadvantage. Furthermore, the fact that our own bound tariff rates are so low greatly limits our ability to persuade other countries to move in our direction. We should also acknowledge the fact that under the WTO system, we are living through an era of massive trade imbalances around the world. The United States has run a trade deficit in every year since it joined the WTO. But we are not alone. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, many of the economies in Central and South America have also had trade deficits for much of the last quarter century. At the same time, many of the major economies in Northern Europe and East Asia have consistently had very large trade surpluses. Of course, there are certainly legitimate market factors that contribute to these long-running imbalances. But the fact that these imbalances remain in place year after year, decade after decade, through periods of growth and periods of recession, indicates that they may be impervious to market forces. This fact, in turn, raises the possibility that these global imbalances are driven, at least in part, by non-market forces. To the extent this is the case, countries and interest groups that benefit from such non-market forces will likely resist efforts to develop new rules that could address those forces and lead to more balanced trade. At a minimum, these long-running imbalances complicate efforts to build coalitions in this area. And that brings us to another incentive to resist changes to the WTO rulebook. The apparent belief by many members that they can get what they want through litigation rather than negotiation. Over the last 25 years, we have seen aggressive efforts to use the WTO dispute settlement process to obtain outcomes to which the United States never agreed. Here are a few examples. In both the Uruguay round and the Doha round, the United States steadfastly resisted vociferous efforts by certain members to weaken the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy rules. One would have thought that those negotiations would have established beyond question that the United States had not agreed to significantly weaken its rules on unfair trade. Instead, the United States has faced a never-ending blizzard of attacks on those rules at the WTO, and many of those attacks have succeeded. Time and time again, U.S. administrations of both parties have been frustrated by appellate body rulings that chip away at the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy rules, despite the fact that the United States certainly never agreed to make such changes. The agreement on safeguards is one of the most critical aspects of the WTO system. Safeguards like those that the United States imposes under Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974 are critical to addressing global import surges that can overwhelm a particular industry. Unfortunately, the WTO dispute settlement process has been used to attack the agreement on safeguards and thereby make it more difficult for U.S. policymakers to use this vital tool. In the past 2 years, 40% of all the dispute settlement cases brought at the WTO were brought against the United States, a free and open economy with an enormous and growing trade deficit. Right now, we face a case from Canada that would do severe damage to our unfair trade laws. We face 9 cases claiming that the WTO can determine what is and is not essential to U.S. security, a position with which the United States has never agreed. We face a case from China attacking the use of Section 301 to cover unfair actions not covered by the WTO, even though we made clear at the time we joined the WTO that we retain the right to use Section 301 in such circumstances. In short, there is an aggressive and ongoing litigation effort to stop critical steps by the United States to address the numerous market-distorting forces that hurt U.S. workers. These litigation efforts rest on the fact that the WTO's appellate body has a long and troubling history of overreaching when it comes to interpreting the WTO agreements. Back in the early 1990s, the United States agreed to a process to help WTO members resolve disputes. We did not agree to let the appellate body bind members with new rules. For years, U.S. policymakers of both parties have made this point, but their concerns have been largely disregarded. These facts should trouble anyone who cares about the long-term future of the international trading system. Judicial activism at the WTO plainly makes it harder to revitalize the negotiating arm of that body. As long as other countries believe that they can obtain the results they want by suing the United States and waiting for the appellate body to rule in their favor, we will not see serious negotiations at the WTO. Negotiations imply compromise, and a party that expects to prevail through litigation is not likely to be interested in compromise. In short, after almost 25 years, it is clear that WTO members have come to a crossroad. The administration wants to revitalize the WTO, to restart its negotiating arm, to develop new rules for new problems, to show that the WTO can fulfill its promise and help U.S. workers and businesses live and compete in a fairer and more prosperous world. We urge our allies to join us in this cause. As time goes on, I believe that more and more members, including our traditional allies, will recognize that their best interest lies not in criticizing the United States or in blocking us or in suing us. Instead, I believe that they will work with us because they know that the United States offers the best hope for building a market-based economic system that promises greater prosperity for all. Ambassador Lighthizer has said that if the WTO did not exist, we would have to invent it. Today's policymakers do not have to do that work. Previous generations have already done so. Let us now take up the task of reforming the WTO so that it can help us address the new challenges of the future. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. If you'd like to stay at the podium, I know the panel needs to get underway shortly, but if you have time for one or two questions, I've collected a few
I'm happy to take questions
from some trade experts. So let me ask first. In recent days, both EU and Canadian officials have suggested that if the U.S. reaches a deal with China, the WTO MFN principle would require that China and the U.S. would have to extend the benefits, such as lower auto tariffs, to other WTO member nations. In your view, is this a correct interpretation of WTO rules?
Well, I think obviously that's going to be, first of all, I don't want to sort of imply anything about what's happening in the negotiations, right? I mean, other than what Ambassador Lighthizer has already said. I think it'll obviously be a question in terms, first of all, you'd want to see what ends up being in the agreement. And then second of all, you would want to see what exactly obligations China has taken on. As a general matter, obviously, people are supposed to grant each other MFN treatment. But until you knew more about kind of the specifics of the agreement or what the agreement was going to entail, I think it would be really premature to make any final judgments on that.
Right, and secondly, you mentioned the self-designation status of developed versus developing market economies in your remarks. I think you mentioned Korea as one example of a developing economy. I was in Geneva last week at the WTO, and I was surprised to learn that Singapore, Kuwait, and Qatar also define themselves as developing economies. So perhaps you could, in a bit more detail, describe the implications of that, what it means, and maybe for a lay American audience, lay that out.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just talk a little bit about, I mean, I know a lot of people here know the history really, really well. I mean, obviously, look, you had a situation where coming out of the Uruguay round, there was a desire to have a Doha development round, right? And the idea of that was to help make the trading system work better for developing countries. And there were papers and ideas put forward that seemed to indicate developing countries would receive special differential treatment. In other words, they would not have to take on the same level of obligations as other members. And at the same time, members were basically given the opportunity to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be developing countries. Well, the result is that, outside the United States and the EU, the vast majority of members have designated themselves as developing countries. This obviously means that any sort of market opening or access provisions that were agreed to would have delivered very little benefits to the U.S. and the EU and other developed countries, and that was a big part of the problem that we had in those negotiations. And it's going to be, a problem in negotiations going forward. So we do have to really think about this, and people have to kind of, the other thing I would point out is that in the 20 years since then, we've learned a lot more about how the global economy works. We've seen countries like China and India, enjoy tremendous growth, far above anything that we're seeing in the West. So the idea that the global trading system is somehow unfair to these countries doesn't have the same resonance, I think, that it did 20 years ago. So we want people to really think about this, look at it, and we think it is important in terms of getting people to move forward.
Great. Well, thanks again for coming, and I'll hand it over to Vaughn, the panel.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Peter. Very warm welcome also from my side to this timely event. And thank you to Hudson Institute for having us today. I would like first to introduce our distinguished panelists. After that, I would like to give each of them 5 to 10 minutes for some introductory remarks. We will then have a round of questions on the podium. After that, I will open the forum to the public for your questions. And we will need to finish at around 1:45. Let's start with Peter Rashish. We just spoke about the pronunciation, and I hope it was okay this way. Peter is a senior fellow and the director of the geoeconomics program at the American Institute of Contemporary German Studies, AICGS, in Washington. He has 25 years, or even more, 25 years of experience counseling corporations, think tanks, foundations, and international organizations on transatlantic trade and economic policy. He served as vice president for Europe and Eurasia at the US Chamber of Commerce, where he spearheaded an ambitious and comprehensive trade agreement between the United States and Europe. Previously, Peter was a senior advisor for Europe at McLarty Associates, and he has been executive vice president of the European Institute. In Paris, he worked for the International Energy Agency, and he has been a consultant to the World Bank, the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, and many other well-known international organizations. His commentaries have been published by the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, among many other media outlets. And Peter writes the wider Atlantic bloc. Thank you, Peter, for being here with us today. Sitting next to him, I would like to welcome Takeshi Komoto. Konnichiwa. Komoto-san serves as minister at the Embassy of Japan in the US, and I found out we arrived somehow at the same time in June last year for our assignment here in the US. At the Japanese embassy, Komoto-san is responsible for the policy areas economy, trade, business, industry, and energy. Formerly, he was managing director of the Multilateral Trading System Department of Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, METI, and previously he worked as director for the Bureau of Economic Revitalization of Japan at the Cabinet Secretariat of the Japanese government, and in this capacity, he was one of the, let's say, creators, one of the major players behind the famous Abenomics, as we all know. This is not your first assignment to the United States. Between 2013 and 2016, you served as Executive Director of the New York office of the Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO. And right now at the embassy, that's not so much a surprise. Your focus is how to navigate and manage Japan's trade and investment relationship with the United States. Thank you also for joining us. Last but not least, right next to me, Tom Duesterberg. Tom is the author of the report, The Importance of WTO Reform from a Transatlantic Perspective. And right at the beginning, thank you for that. He's a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. Previously, Tom has been the executive director of the Manufacturing and Society in the 21st Century program of Aspen Institute. For more than 10 years, you served as president and CEO of the Manufacturing Alliance, MAPI, and you worked as Assistant Secretary for International Economic Policy at the Department of Commerce after 2 jobs, I think, as Chief of Staff on Capitol Hill. You wrote or co-wrote 4 books, among them U.S. Manufacturing, the Engine of Growth in a Global Economy, plus more than 150 articles in major journals and newspapers, and I don't even start to mention all the newspapers. Thank you again for your report. Thank you again for your time. Let's start with you, Tom, as the author of the report. Yesterday, before the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance, Ambassador Lighthizer said, according to the transcript, and you quoted it as well, the WTO is a valuable institution and offers many opportunities for the United States to advance our interests on trade. If we did not have the WTO, we would need to invent it. I think that's a good starting point for our today's discussion. Before we are going to address the concerns Trade Representative Lighthizer expressed and the concerns we've heard already during the keynote address, I would like to invite you, Tom, to summarize the key findings of your report, given that you tried to approach the whole topic from a transatlantic perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for participating with us in this project. First, by way of introduction, I think it's worthwhile to remember why we need reform. Stephen Vaughn gave a very comprehensive overview. I would just add a couple of things. First, trade expansion in the world has slowed significantly since the 80s and the 90s, whereas we had a 7% annual growth rate in those years of global trade. It slowed to 4% or less in recent years. So it had been a driver of global economic growth, and that is slowing. As Stephen pointed out, the WTO is not addressing many 21st century economy problems, including the problems associated with the losers of global trade. He referred to them as blue-collar workers, but it's much broader than that. And we see this not only in the United States in the election of Donald Trump, but we see this in Europe as well. Third, there's the rise of new mercantilist tendencies among global actors, notably China, but not limited to China. Fourth, the enforcement actions of the WTO have gotten agonizingly slow, and we need to speed those up. And fifth, I would just note that, as Stephen mentioned, there have been no new major rounds or comprehensive agreements in the WTO since its founding in 1995. It came into existence. Part of that is due, and I'll talk about this in a minute, to the MFN principle. So I divide the problems into 2 baskets. One, gaps in coverage for the 21st century economy. Services is the main area, and I would emphasize this because a number of studies have shown, including one by the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization, that if we could get broader coverage in services, we could improve productivity in the global economy by as much as 22%. This also covers the digital economy, which Ambassador Vaughn or Stephen Vaughn mentioned. Other major areas are coverage of state-owned enterprises, which have enjoyed a recrudescence in recent years, especially in China. 40% of the Chinese economy is dominated by state-owned enterprises. It's higher in Russia, some other places. In China, the amount of loans being given out to support enterprise are 3 times higher for state-owned enterprises than for the private sector, and this is a drag on growth in China. Third, the well-known problems of forced technology transfer and, in general, enforcement of intellectual property rights. The World Bank study I mentioned also emphasizes the need for more uniform investment rules. The second basket, which Steve Vaughn covered pretty well, the WTO operations, problems with that. Rules of enforcement, transparency, lack of notification of subsidies, for instance, speed of actions, consistency of actions. You also mentioned the ability to self-declare developing in underdeveloped country status, and the problems of the dispute settlement body, which has taken on legislative and expanded judicial functions rightfully belonging to the membership. I would just note that these disputes go back well beyond the Trump administration. The first actions stemmed from the infamous 2005 decision on zeroing out decisions related to anti-dumping cases. So what are the possible solutions? There are good discussions between, at the trilateral level, US, EU, and Japan, and progress has been made on intellectual property, on transparency. We need to work hard to bring more into that, that dialogue, or that trialogue, to invent a word. I would note, too, that one of the major problems of the World Trade Organization is the MFN principle. Not anything can be agreed until all agree. There are 164 nations in the World Trade Organization, pretty much proven that it's impossible to get full agreement. So one possibility, and Ambassador Lighthizer actually mentioned this in his testimony yesterday, is the need to use more plurilateral agreements. And there are clauses in the WTO rules which allow the membership to bypass the MFN requirement through a 75% vote, a supermajority vote, to allow non-MFN plurilaterals to go into effect as long as they cover most trade and as long as they are open to joining by other members. We had this in the Information Technology Agreement in 1997, I believe. Discussions on digital commerce are underway. Also with services, the service sector, for some reason I don't understand, does not require MFN, so we could conceivably move a little faster with the services area. I won't add much to the Steve Vaughn's discussion of the problems with the appellate body, only to say that my understanding of the U.S. position is simply that we revert to the original WTO agreement and the limitations on judicial rulemaking by the appellate bodies. I would note that in my view, I don't think that there is going to be agreement on WTO reform unless the U.S. and Europe can coordinate their positions and be aggressive in working with countries like Japan, Australia, other like-minded parties. One potential stumbling block, at least in the digital services area, that we're going to have to overcome is the different approaches to privacy which is going to affect digital commerce. We have huge differences between the US and Europe, and with China for that matter. So there are issues to overcome on a transatlantic basis, but with goodwill on all sides, hopefully we can make some progress. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. And now let's move on to Takeshi Komoto. At the MC11, the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in December 2017 in Buenos Aires, United States, the European Union, and Japan initiated a process to develop common approaches to reform the WTO. From a Japanese perspective, what would be the priorities?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me to share with you how Japan sees this issue, a very important issue of WTO reform. And in a word, we are very committed. As you recall, G20 leaders last year agreed to work on this WTO reform issue and agreed to review the progress at the next summit meeting, which will take place this June in Osaka. And so Prime Minister Abe, of course, as a chair, will take up this issue very seriously. And Prime Minister himself is very committed. He mentioned about WTO and its necessity of reform at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, and also in his policy speech at the Japanese Diet, which is basically equivalent to Parliament, in January, and literally called for WTO reform to regain the trust of global trading system. So he is very committed. And on the specific items, I think two previous speakers mentioned most of the items, so I'm not sure if I had a lot to add, but if I can just touch upon the items in accordance of the three main WTO functions, meaning monitoring, dispute settlement, and rulemakings, I would like to touch upon several. Under the monitoring pillar, notification transparency proposal, which Steve have already mentioned, this is one of the important deliverables by this trilateral trade ministers meeting between Japan, US, and EU. We have several co-sponsors, and we are now discussing Geneva, and we will have Council on Trade and Goods in April. We will have General Counsel in May, and we will have G20 meetings in June. So as we would like to see more and more discussion and more support on this proposal. Basically, we are not asking for any additional obligation. We just want to make sure that those rules are implemented. So I hope more and more members can join us. On the dispute settlement pillar, appellate body reform is one of the focus. We know that U.S. has a very strong position, so Japan would like to bridge the gaps between the views of members, and we believe that we will be able to come to a solution or solution. On rulemakings, I think we have two items. One is the e-commerce that have been mentioned. I'm proud to say that I was one of the founding members of this e-commerce initiative in December 2017 in Buenos Aires, so I have a lot of passion on this. In Buenos Aires, 71 members signed on to this joint statement. Last January, 76 members signed to this joint statement, expressing the intent to commence WTO negotiations. Last year, we had 9 meetings in Geneva. This was not a negotiation. This was still kind of a study group. So after a year of study, I think we are ready to launch the negotiations, and we would like to see it happen this year. The other item under this rulemaking is, I think, industrial subsidies. Three ministers, Japan, US, and EU, are discussing how we can develop rules on this industrial subsidy issue. I think our global economies has concern on this issue because certain countries seem to develop SOEs into champions and setting them loose in global markets. So we would like to see new rules to secure a level playing field. So I think those are kind of the key items that we are discussing. Some promising, some are still challenging, but again, Japan is very committed in this global trading system. So we will would like to lead the discussion on forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Komodo. Last but not least, Peter Rashish. I'd like to quote something you co-wrote in an article in August last year for the National Interest. Quote, the Trump administration needs to demonstrate that it is willing to shift from a scorecard approach to trade policy, who's winning the deficit competition, to one based on writing rule books, who is playing fair, whatever the outcome concerning surpluses and deficits. Without that change to outlook, US participation in international economic institutions and agreements will remain at risk, meaning that it will more likely be US economic isolationism, not tensions with Russia, that could start to cause the Western liberal order to crumble. End of quote. Would this position, from your point of view, also apply to the question on how to reform the WTO?
Well, of course, I've changed my mind completely since I wrote that. So,
I knew that.
no, but I think we're talking about rules today, and so I think that in that sense, maybe what I had to say was relevant. And what I'd like to do is offer a few thoughts about how the European Union views WTO reform and a bit about implications for the transatlantic relationship. I mean, we've discussed a bit that there is quite a bit of overlap, at least I think, and I do think there's quite a bit of overlap between the US and the EU views, both in what the problems are and how to proceed, but we've also discussed that there are some differences, and if you're on the lookout for the transatlantic relationship, it probably wouldn't be good to turn cooperation in the WTO setting into a test case for that relationship. And I'm not sure also that's a way to advance trade reform, and we do have a number of avenues. Some have also been discussed, the WTO, but also other avenues in other fora. But let me offer you some thoughts about the EU's role in the international economy, because I think the nature of that role helps us understand a lot about how the EU approaches WTO reform. And I think it's really important to remember that the EU does not only have policies toward the WTO as something outside itself, but that it is also a bit like the WTO. It is itself a multilateral organization, maybe a multilateral plus organization. And so it is, I think, the most important regional building block of the international economic order, kind of aligned with the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank. And I think because of that structural role that the EU plays in the international economic order, the EU is always going to be greater than the sum of its member states' policies. It's really, I think the right way to look at the EU is as a kind of first cousin of the WTO, and because of that, any threat to multilateralism, I think, is also would be seen as the EU would see that as a threat to itself. But I think that also means that the EU's position is very different right now from, say, the position of the United States or Japan. I think that the WTO has helped all three of those economies to thrive, but the WTO has also helped to promote the role and identity of the EU as an institution within the international economic system. And I think that's very different from the situation in the United States or Japan. Now, if the world were to move more towards a power-based trading system, not that I think anybody should want that, but if we did, and rather than a world organized according to rules, I think that kind of Wild West landscape would be something that perhaps Japan and the United States might regret, but I think they could become resigned to it, because the United States and Japan, being full nation states, have the entire range of foreign and security and economic and other policies at their command in an integrated fashion, so they could manage to survive and advance their interests in that kind of world economy. That's not the case with the European Union. In a rules-based trading world, the EU is an economic superpower, but because it has this very complex institutional setup, because it has limited powers, I think it cannot draw on this kind of very broad toolkit. So if the world moved towards a less rule-based arrangement, that I think would be detrimental to the EU's role, and I think it probably sees that. And I think one of the consequences of the EU's seeing itself as not just a producer of policies, but also as a multilateral actor within the economic system, is that it has tended to want to boost the legitimacy of the liberal order by increasing the independence of judicial bodies within it. And I think we have a very good example a few years ago during the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations, when the EU pushed the pause button and decided to revisit its approach to investor-state dispute settlement. Because there were a lot of protests that it was providing too much influence for investor interests over state interests. And so the EU came up with something that it called the investment court system, where each of its bilateral trade agreements, for example, the one with Canada, includes this arrangement, this kind of standing body instead of the ad hoc panels that it had before. And they've even taken this a bit further with the idea of a multilateral investment court, which would become a permanent tribunal to cover all trade agreements globally. So I think on that issue, the EU, I think, agrees with the US that some kind of investor-state dispute settlement increases the rule of law, but that it'd rather have something that is much more insulated from special interests, whether those are private or public interests. So I think you can see this same phenomenon at work with the EU's approach to the WTO. Again, I think it's important to stress that on a wide range of issues, whether it's state-owned enterprises, technology transfers, subsidies, intellectual property, a whole range of issues, the US and the EU seems to look at things the way the US does and vice versa. But I do think there is a divide on the exact balance to strike between the role of the judicial and the legislative functions of the WTO, and we've talked about that. That's centered on the dispute settlement system and the appellate body. And if we look at the EU's reforms for the appellate body, there does seem to be an inclination to find a solution through increasing its independence. When you look at, for example, that they want to extend the period of service from the judges from 4 to 8 years, make service a full-time occupation, increase the number of judges, various things that seem to want to increase its independence. And I think it's fair to say that where the EU proposals fall short from, I think from the perspective of this administration, is that they don't address this gray area of WTO law. In other words, how should the appellate body treat cases where the WTO's founding texts were deliberately ambiguous? So that begs the question of how do we move forward? I think there's one idea that you've seen sort of floated, which is that the WTO would move ahead without the United States, and by invoking Article 25, which allows for ad hoc arbitration to be set up instead of using the dispute settlement and the appellate body. I don't know that that would be in the EU's interests. There's a lot of things the EU needs, has a lot of offensive and defensive trade interests where cooperation with the United States is vital. I think it also is true in the other direction, but I mean, some of those would be removing the 232 aluminum and steel tariffs, trying not to have auto tariffs come on, more positively coordinating foreign investment screening between the two, writing rules for digital trade, as we discussed, and not to mention these creating new disciplines for global trade in the WTO. So I don't think that with sort of the US as an odd man out in the WTO, that's really going to help the EU achieve its trade policy goals. So I think we do have to pick up a little bit on what Tom said, we do have to really emphasize all of the possible tracks in addition to the WTO track. And we do have the US-EU trade negotiations, which were launched last July. And there, for example, in addition to the focus on industrial tariffs and regulatory alignment, why don't the EU and the US also make rules and these kind of WTO issues more of a priority. And it seems to me, for example, why don't the two sides agree on a common code on how to treat state-owned enterprises and on ways to enforce that code? And they could, for example, build on the text that is in the U.S.-Mexico agreement, which itself is based on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The trilateral process was also mentioned among the U.S., the EU, and Japan. That, again, is tended to focus on subsidies, intellectual property, technology transfer, not on dispute settlement, but they could add that to the agenda. And then I would endorse what Tom said about plurilateral agreements. I think, whether inside or outside. Some have been inside, like the technology agreement or the government procurement agreement. Some have been or are outside, depending on how you want to look at the trade and services agreement. But in any case, if you take the U.S. and all its trade agreement partners and the EU and all its trade agreement partners, that's a really large, critical mass of countries. And if they could agree on some of these WTO reform countries, then perhaps we can hope that one day those can be brought into the WTO if needed, once it appears there's something nearing a consensus among its members. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. Before I open the floor for questions from your side, just one first question to you, Tom. I mean, in your report, you mentioned the problem of services not being part of the WTO as one of the core, let's say, problems. And as you mentioned before, actually, it's not part of the MFN principles. So there could be a lot of plurilateral talks being possible. From your point of view, I mean, there's differences, of course, from trade agreement to trade agreement, from country to country, but would you be able to identify the core obstacles when it comes to including services into these agreements?
Well, I think maybe even Stephen pointed this out. Economies develop outside WTO disciplines, and you develop national champions is not quite the right word, but you develop strengths in certain areas. Let's just take one example, which is financial services. The Chinese have promised to allow payment systems for outsiders, non-Chinese, to enter the Chinese market. They made that promise, I think, in 2006. It hasn't been implemented yet. But in the meantime, they've developed world-class, world-leading even payment systems in China. So they're not going to be eager in that, because of that, to give concessions to, as part of a broader agreement. I think you can generalize that in other ways. It's just the entrenched interests, as always, are a major problem in services as in the industrial sector.
And I might add, we see these examples all around Southeast Asia as well. I mean, there's from country to country, a lot of, especially the banking or the financial services, are one of the biggest problems. Komoto-san, I hope I got you right. You said that the role of Japan could be kind of trying to bridge the gap between Europe and the US when it comes to the litigation issue, or could you elaborate on that?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I did not only mean between like US and the EU. As G20 chair, we would like to bridge I'm not sure if the gap is the right word, but differences among all countries. And I think what you mean is about the appellate body?
Yes, exactly.
Well, we all know it's not a secret that the U.S. has a very strong position, and we hear them. And some others, not only EU, but many WTO members have their own view. So we would like to contribute to the discussion to bring people together, members together.
In what way?
We're working on it. We are talking intensely to many WTO members in Geneva, in their capitals, very much.
Yeah. That's not the hopeful end of this panel discussion, or it could be, but let's wait and see. Finally, coming back to you, Peter, and I'm a European, I'm a German. It was great to listen to what you said about multilateralism as a core principle of how the European Union is structured, of course. But you mentioned one aspect about these laws or regulations, texts which are deliberately more ambiguous within the WTO framework, and yeah, how to address these ambiguous, let's say, regulations. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, let me offer that really important caveat, probably especially in this room, that I'm not a lawyer. But I think that it seems to me, if you look at the EU's reform proposals, one of them is something that promotes greater dialogue between the judicial and, let's say, legislative functions, to simplify, between the appellate body and the council. And that seems to be in the spirit, I think, of what in the direction of what the United States would like, if I understand the United States concerns, but perhaps not enough. I think that that in order to reach more of a consensus, you might need to move towards removing some of the ambiguity. I think that's probably where we would have to end up. But how you get there, I would leave that to others.
Thank you so much. Time for your questions. I would kindly ask you to perhaps introduce yourself briefly. We have microphones, ladies and gentlemen, walking around with microphones. I have one question here.
Hello, my name's Curtis Ellis. I'm with America First Policies. Thank you very much, Mr. Vaughn. Incredible, useful presentation, and to the panel, likewise usefully. Trying to get back to this original question, can the U.S. and allies agree on WTO reform? What we learned from Mr. Vaughn and from everyone else is that one of the key problems, and to my opinion, reflecting only my opinion, the key problem is developing nation status. And it would seem that naturally the U.S. and its allies, European Union and Japan, being developed countries, should be able to agree on a reform on the developing nation status. But listening to Mr. Rashish, I wonder if perhaps the problem why U.S. and its allies, particularly the EU, cannot come to an agreement on such a basic and what seems to me clear-cut problem is that Germany has used multilateralism to achieve hegemonic status in Europe the same way China is trying to use WTO multilateralism to achieve hegemonic status on a global level. So multilateralism is in the DNA of Germany and the EU, as you pointed out, and is that what is preventing the US and its, at least, Atlantic allies from agreeing on WTO reform? That's to whoever.
Would you like?
I wonder if you could clarify the question. You're suggesting that Germany's role within the European Union is creating a blockage to the
on an unconscious level, not consciously. I'm just wondering if this respect for the rules-based international economic order, and we don't want to upset the apple cart, and if that's not consciously blocking, but let's go back to the question: why can't the U.S. and the European Union and our Japanese allies, on this one issue of developing nations, self-identifying as a developing nation, as WTO reform?
Well, I wanted to make the point that the EU is objectively a different animal from the United States or Japan, and I think because of that, it's going to approach some of these issues differently. But I don't think that the fact that it is not a nation state and that is something in between a multilateral organization and a supranational, I don't think that needs to prevent agreement between the United States and the EU on this particular issue. No, I do not.
I would just comment too. I think there is a case, and I give the caveat, I'm not a lawyer either, but I think there's an ongoing WTO case brought by the United States to which Europe has joined and Japan has joined around that question of China as a developing country. And I think it has something to do with how the anti-dump laws are applied. Am I right on that, Steve?
China has brought a case against the EU, against the United States, claiming that it should be treated as a market economy.
That's right, yeah.
So it's not exactly the same, but it is, and in fact, the U.S. and the EU have worked together very closely.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Nawatsu Aoyama from Japan's newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun. I want to put a question about the use of the Trump administration's aggressive use of unilateral tariff measures, especially the Section 232 auto tariffs, whose targets would be not China, but the US key allies, including Japan and the EU member countries, and also which would potentially allow China to play one country off against, play one country off another. And how much of an impact of these tariffs or the use of the tariffs have on the reform of the WTO, for which the US, the EU, and Japan should join forces?
Well, yeah, I'll take that one on. It's a tough question. I think if the United States pulled the trigger on auto tariffs, that would, number one, throw the world economy into at least a minor recession. I mean, the world economy is weakening almost everywhere. I am not a particular fan of using 232 on autos. I think if it were invoked, it would certainly put an end to the US-EU trade negotiation. But on the other hand, I think what people have to understand is that to have a negotiation, you have to have two sides. And I think as Mr. Vaughn's presentation, I think, elaborated on, there's a certain amount of frustration in the United States about the help that it's getting, for instance, in taking on China on some of the issues that we all agree on anyway, but there's not that much collaborative effort yet. With regard to the US-EU purported negotiation, which was announced in July of last year, the EU doesn't even have a mandate yet to negotiate. They've taken agriculture off the table. President Macron has said we should negotiate with the United States because they're not a member of the Paris Climate Accord. There is a huge ongoing trade deficit between the United States and Europe. Agricultural tariffs are much higher in Europe than they are in the United States. Germany runs a trade surplus globally of 8% of GDP, and there's no precedent in history. There's no precedent in history for that sort of consistent trade surplus, and yet Germany does not take measures, as the European Commission has recommended, to stimulate its economy and thereby reduce some of the trade surplus. So all that's by way of saying the United States has been frustrated. Ambassador Lighthizer has made it very clear that no international body is going to define the national security interests of the United States. So in its frustration, I think that is a reason that this idea is being floated.
Peter, anything to add from your side?
Well, I would, on that, just the last point you made, I mean, I think that it is probably something that every member of the WTO should want to avoid, and having the WTO decide whether or not a particular trade policy action is in the national security interest of a member state. But because of that, it strikes me it's also every member of the WTO should think very long and hard about whether ever to invoke that national security clause, because you wouldn't want the WTO to be ruling on that.
Just as one anecdote that's often repeated, years ago, Sweden invoked the national security clause to protect its shoe industry, to provide shoes to their armed forces. But
Thank you so much. So I have a question here, and then with you.
Hi, Brett Fortin with Inside U.S. Trade. Given the clear link the U.S. has made between the appellate body overreach and the paralysis of the WTO's negotiating arm, does the issue of special and differential treatment and the paralysis of the negotiating arm have to be addressed before the appellate body would be restored to full functionality? I'm referring to the U.S. blocking of the nominations to the appellate body. And is that something that is seen as feasible, given that many WTO members, even those that agree with the U.S. stance on special and differential treatment, think it's better addressed in the negotiations themselves?
I didn't get your name.
Brett Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade.
Thank you. Tom?
well, I think the clock is ticking on the appellate body, and that's going to take precedence. The issue of special and differential is extremely hard to reach agreement on. I mean, Mr. Vaughn went on at some length about the opposition to that, and it's pretty broadly spread. India, China, these are powerful forces, so it's the way to achieve reform is not all that clear. So I don't think that is going to happen before the clock runs out on the appellate body.
At the end of the year.
At the end of the year.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Herman Bauma with the National Association for Objectivity in Science. I've often hear President Trump saying he has this preference for bilateral trade agreements. He thinks those are much better, just to negotiate with one country at a time, have a bilateral agreement. Forgive my ignorance, but in the context of the WTO and the whole international trade structure, how would these bilateral trade agreements fit in? Are they permitted within the WTO? Are they subject to the MFN provision? It's not clear to me how they would fit into the structure.
I can take that on.
I can follow up.
Okay. Well, I think technically bilateral agreements or plurilateral agreements can be a part of the World Trade Organization sort of basket, and they've been used fairly widely, I mean, by everyone, especially in recent years, since we can't achieve agreement at the full WTO level on just about anything. So, but a bilateral agreement can be sanctioned as a part of the WTO if a couple of criteria are met. One, it doesn't harm the bound tariffs or other major economic interests of the other members. And number two, if it covers substantially all trade between the two parties or the two or more parties in a plurilateral agreement. So traditionally, substantial coverage has meant something like 90% of all trade. And that's what happened, for instance, in the Information Technology Agreement in the late 1990s. It was only 21 nations, but they covered over 90% of global trade in information technology products.
If I may add, yes, please. So I think multilateral is the ideal approach, but with the 164 members, it's very difficult to come to a consensus or agreement on basically anything. So I think that is why a lot of members have started to use this sort of approach of plurilateral or bilateral. One great example is the free trade agreement or economic partnership agreement that Tom just described. And for Japan, we have a lot of FTAs, CPAs, and the most recent one is the CPTPP, which used to be called TPP with US, but now without US with 11 members, which came into effect at the end of last year. And we have also concluded EPA with European Union, which came into effect on February 1st, about a month ago. But we believe that it is a building block for the development of multilateral trading system, meaning sort of develop new rules of trade. Then hopefully in the future it can be adopted by other members. So it is kind of frontier of rulemakings. And also one of the feature of the Japanese FTA, EPA sort of approach and strategy is that this is different from US approach, but we are pursuing more regional what we call mega regional EPAs, because we believe that supply chains and value chains are more regional, global than bilateral. So that is why we go for more regional EPAs. And one of the focus for this year is to conclude EPA, which is what is called RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This comprises of ASEAN 10 countries, plus China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. So this is something that we would like to conclude by the end of this year, which will cover a lot of trade on the other side of the Pacific.
If I may follow, how does the most favored nation, how does the most favored nation rule fit into these agreements?
So maybe he just mentioned, but if you have this substantial trade, about more than like 90%, it is considered legitimate in the WTO system, and it will not need to provide MFN treatment to other parties outside of this FTA, EPA.
I do have a question here, and then you. No, at the very end, the gentleman standing in. Thank you.
Hello, my name is James Lucier. I'm with Capital Alpha Partners. Been following your conversation about the WTO very carefully. I think we can all be very hopeful of progress on the WTO front, but we haven't talked about three near-term problems. One is the successful completion and ratification of the USMCA agreement. The second is the US-China trade agreement of some sort. And then the third would be the US-Japan agreement on trade in goods. And my question is, to what extent is it necessary to conclude these, hopefully successfully, as soon as possible for the WTO talks to continue? And if we have failure at any one of these points, for instance, the failure of Congress to wrap up and ratify USMCA by the middle of this year, would that set the cause of WTO reforms back in any way?
Happy that you managed to bridge into the WTO topics, the three aspects you mentioned. So I'll accept that question. And who would like to take it on?
I'll start, perhaps.
Yeah.
In an answer to a previous question, I think I implied that, number one, the US-EU nexus is extremely important. And number two, that there are some warning signs with regard to the U.S.-EU relationship that are playing out in the attempt to get a bilateral negotiation going. And that in the worst case scenario, for instance, if we had auto tariffs imposed, I think all, for at least the short run, near-term cooperation would cease. I don't think any of the other cases you mentioned, the China agreement or the new NAFTA, would have that much of an impact on the multilateral front.
I see a different kind of connection. I'm not sure there's a connection with the WTO, but I think that there is a relationship among the negotiations that the United States is engaged in. In other words, I think that if the Congress ratifies the USMCA, that gives a kind of fixed point for other trading partners with which the United States is negotiating. So the EU then sees, okay, this is the kind of deal that the administration likes to negotiate and that can be passed by Congress. So I think that gives, while it puts more spotlight on the US-EU or US-Japan talks, it also, I think, creates this kind of sense of certainty about what the endpoint might look like.
If I can just add from our end, is that I don't necessarily see kind of a link between our bilateral trade talks and the WTO discussion, but as I have mentioned and other colleagues have mentioned, that we are working with EU and US on WTO reform, so that we would like to advance and lead the discussion and outreach to other members. And I don't think this will be affected by our bilateral trade talks that we are about to enter. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
I'm Sibylle Zitko from the EU delegation here in Washington. I just want to make one comment with regard to the EU-US bilateral talks, just that the wrong impression is not created. So I think we expect very much to have a mandate for negotiation in the next few weeks. Our commissioner said that also last week at Georgetown when she was here. And of course, from our point of view, I mean, the scope is very much defined by what the President Juncker and President Trump agreed last July to have a, start out with a limited, industrial tariffs only, negotiation, regulatory issues, and I just wanted to also make the point that, I mean, the cooperation on China in particular is also part of our bilateral talks very much. And I think we, see very much eye to eye on the problems that are out there. We don't always agree on the prescription, I think, and on the remedies, but I think we see very much eye to eye. And there's a lot of cooperation, actually, a lot of, I think we share the concerns. So I just wanted to put that out there. That is part of it, and we hope to get negotiations going soon. And actually, some of the regulatory discussions that were also agreed are already underway. So.
Thank you for specifying that. Really appreciate that. Do we have any further questions? I have to bear in mind that there's also some younger audience. Not asking? No, it does not seem, we seem to have all the questions answered. Any final remarks from your side? Peter, what would be the hopeful message at the very end of this discussion? I mean, we've heard one already.
Well, in my talk, in my remarks, I said I sort of took it from the EU's point of view, but I want to reinforce that it's not just that the EU can benefit from having a strong relationship with the United States for a number of trade policy reasons. The United States also needs the EU if it wants to get most of its agenda done, including on WTO reform. So just sort of putting myself more into the, into perspective of my hometown of Washington, I would say that when the U.S. thinks about things like auto tariffs, that it really needs to think very hard about whether that's more important than maintaining strong cooperation with the EU on these global trade reform issues. I think that's something that's ahead of the administration.
Thank you. Water-san.
So I think WTO is a public good, and there are 164 members. So I think each of us need to have the ownership of the WTO and think about it, and not do you think it as something that issues that the Japan, EU, and Europe and China, India, all these big players are discussing about? But I hope that all 164 members will think about this issue very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
I would just like to associate myself with Peter's remarks about the need for U.S.-EU cooperation, and I would note too with Japan and maybe some of our other close allies. I just don't think it's going to happen unless we find ways to work together. There is opposition to almost all the proposals we've seen for WTO reform that are fairly potent, so we have to find a way around that, and it's not going to happen unless we do cooperate together.
Yeah, as you said before, the clock is ticking, and I can just subscribe to that. I'd like to give us a big hand to all our panelists first, and also I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Hudson Institute for having us today, and finally, last but not least, Tom for contributing his study, and thanks to all of you for your interest, participation, your questions. Thank you so much.